The rain fell on New York City, not as a baptism, but as a judgment. It was a cold, relentless downpour that turned the afternoon sky to the color of a bruise and made the asphalt weep in slick, black rivulets. Neon signs bled their vibrant colors onto the wet streets, their reflections shivering and breaking apart with every passing car. For Alara Vance, the storm outside was merely a mirror of the tempest raging within her. She was 22, but at that moment, huddled in the inadequate shelter of a shop awning, she felt ageless and hollowed out. Her thin jacket, a relic from a life she had just torched, was plastered to her shoulders, and her dark hair clung to her face in dripping tendrils. Water traced paths down her cheeks, mingling with the salt of tears shed an hour ago, an eternity ago. The city roared around her, a symphony of car horns, distant sirens, and the percussive hiss of tires on water. But the only sound she truly heard was the click of a phone disconnecting. It was her sister's voice that had been the final blow. "You're throwing it all away, Alara. Everything Dad and Granddad built. You're walking away from the Vance name for, what? A fantasy?" The Vance name. It wasn't a name, it was a monolith, a dynasty carved from steel, finance, and ruthless ambition. It promised a life of gilded cages, of expectations as heavy and unyielding as a tombstone. For 22 years, she had tried to fit inside it, to muffle the music that was the very rhythm of her soul. But a bird born to sing cannot thrive in silence. Today, she had finally chosen flight, and in doing so, had plummeted from the towering heights of their world into the flooded gutters of this one. The weight of their disappointment was heavier than the rain. Shivering, she clutched the worn leather satchel to her chest. It held everything she had left, a few changes of clothes, a small amount of cash, and the worn sheet music that was her only true inheritance. Driven by a primal need for shelter, she descended the slick steps into the belly of the city, the subway station. The air that hit her was thick and damp, a cocktail of wet wool, stale popcorn, and the metallic tang of the rails. The station was a chaotic microcosm of the city, above a rushing river of people, their faces grim, their umbrellas dripping, their shoes squeaking on the grimy tiles. They flowed around her, an anonymous current, and for a moment, the sheer force of their indifference was a comfort. Here, she was not Alara Vance, the runaway heiress. She was no one, a ghost in the machine. And then she saw it. Tucked away in a neglected corner, like a forgotten memory, stood an old upright piano. It was a battered, bruised thing, its dark wood scarred with the graffiti of 1,000 passing lives. Its keys were yellowed like old teeth, some chipped at the edges. It was out of place, absurd, a relic of a gentler time stranded in the harsh, fluorescent glare of the present. She didn't know why she stopped. Perhaps it was the only thing in this roaring, alien world that felt familiar. Perhaps it was the only thing that still made sense. The world had taken everything else from her, her family, her home, her future. But it hadn't taken this. Slowly, as if in a trance, Alara moved toward it. The crowd parted around her, oblivious. She sat down on the warped bench, the damp fabric of her torn dress sticking uncomfortably to her legs. For a long moment, she just stared at the keys, at the faint reflection of her own haunted face in the polished fallboard. Her hands shook as she lifted them. She hadn't played in months, not since the final argument with her father when he had declared her passion a frivolous and unprofitable hobby. But her hands moved anyway. Muscle memory, a language deeper than words, took over. She placed her trembling fingers on the keys, took a shuddering breath, and began to play. The first notes to emerge from the old piano were soft, hesitant, like a whisper testing the acoustics of a hostile room. They were fragile things, born of grief and uncertainty. The sound of Chopin's nocturne in E-flat major stumbling into the clamor of the station. For a few seconds, the melody was swallowed whole by the surrounding chaos. The rumble of an approaching train, the garbled announcement over a loudspeaker, the cacophony of a dozen overlapping conversations. Alara didn't look up. Her world had shrunk to the 88 keys beneath her fingers. She poured into them the sharp-edged words of her sister, the cold finality in her father's eyes, the crushing loneliness that now enveloped her. The music was her confession, her lament, her only form of prayer. At first, nobody noticed. She was just another piece of the urban scenery, another fixture in the chaos, someone to be sidestepped and ignored. But a melody, even a quiet one, has a way of cutting through noise. A teenage boy, his lanky frame swimming in an oversized hoodie, was the first to stop. He nudged his friend, a shorter kid with a backward cap, and pointed a thumb toward Alara. "Look at this," he said, his voice a sneer wrapped in teenage bravado. "She thinks she's in a movie or something." His friend snickered, immediately pulling out his phone to capture the scene. "Yo, this is going viral for all the wrong reasons," he said, zooming in on the tear in Alara's dress and her rain-soaked hair. Tragic girl plays piano in the rain. So original. Alara's fingers faltered for a split second, a single note stuttering in protest. She heard them. The words were like small, sharp stones pelting the fragile shelter she was trying to build around herself with the music. She pressed on, her jaw tightening. The boys, emboldened by her lack of reaction, grew louder. "Get a job, lady," the first one called out, his grin wide and cruel. A few passers-by glanced over, smirking in agreement before hurrying on their way. The small circle of mockery began to expand. A young man named Preston, maybe 25, with slicked back hair and a tailored blazer that screamed junior investment banker, stopped a few feet away. He carried himself with an air of effortless ownership, as if the entire station were a minor inconvenience on his path to greater things. He smirked, his voice loud enough to slice through the noise and the music. "What do you even know about piano?" he said, not to Alara, but to his equally well-dressed friend, who snorted in amusement. The question hung in the damp air, heavy with condescension. It wasn't a question seeking an answer. It was a statement of judgment. It implied that someone who looked like her disheveled, poor, and outcast could not possibly possess genuine knowledge or skill. Alara's hands hesitated again, just for a breath. His words struck a nerve that was already raw. It was the same sentiment her family had expressed, just stripped of its polite, familial veneer. "You don't belong in this world. This is not for you." She kept her head down, her focus locked on the keys. But Preston wasn't finished. "Seriously, look at her," he continued, his voice rising. "She's probably homeless. This is just pathetic." Begging for attention. His friend, a wiry man with a flashy watch, laughed louder and pulled out his own phone to record. "Content, my man. Pure cringe content." The music continued, but now there was a tension in it, a thread of defiance woven into Chopin's sorrow. Alara's fingers pressed harder into the keys, the notes coming out sharper, clearer. She was no longer just playing through her pain. She was playing against theirs, against the wall of derision they were building around her, brick by verbal brick. The station hadn't gotten quieter, but the space around the piano had become a stage, and the audience was gathering not to listen, but to gawk and to judge. The small ripples of mockery quickly swelled into a wave of contempt. A woman named Genevieve, perhaps in her 50s, pushed through the growing crowd, her heels clicking like sharp retorts on the grimy floor. She was draped in a sleek fur coat, incongruous in the damp subway, diamonds glinting at her ears, and her face set in a mask of permanent disapproval. She stopped, looked Alara up and down with a gaze that stripped her of all dignity, and snapped a photo with her phone. "Street drama queen," she muttered, her voice carrying easily. The phrase was picked up by a pair of teenagers nearby, who giggled and mimicked her sneer. "Who even does this anymore?" one of them said, tossing her brightly dyed hair, playing a piano in a subway. So desperate. The woman in the fur coat nodded curtly, as if her judgment had just been validated by the highest court. The air around Alara grew tighter, heavier, like the storm had moved inside. Her jaw was clenched so hard it ached. She didn't look up, she didn't stop, but the laughter grew, spreading like a stain. A man in a cheap suit, his tie loosened from a long, bad day, shook his head. "Nobody plays piano on the street anymore," he said to no one in particular. "This isn't the 1,802nd. A woman next to him, clutching a designer purse like a shield, rolled her eyes. "She's just begging for attention," she said, her voice sharp and scolding. Near the edge of the crowd, a group of college students pushed their way forward. One of them, a young man in a leather jacket who introduced himself to his friends as Ryder, crossed his arms. He was an amateur musician, the kind who carried a guitar case as a personality trait but rarely opened it. "She probably just memorized one piece to get sympathy money," he announced with an air of expertise. His friends, a group of boys with matching smirks, nodded in agreement. "Street performers can never compare to professionals," one of them added, his voice dripping with superiority. They were loud, performing for the crowd as much as Alara was. A young woman in tight jeans and a cropped jacket joined in, her phone already filming. "Fake emotions, fake music," she said, laughing as she zoomed in on Alara's face. The spell of the music, for anyone who might have felt it, was breaking. Laughter crept back in, sharp and cold. A single tear escaped Alara's tightly shut eyes, tracing a clean path through the grime and rain on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She just kept playing, her fingers moving with a desperate steadiness even as her shoulders began to shake. The crowd didn't see her strength. They saw only her weakness. They saw the tear and laughed harder. "Oh, look, she's crying now," the woman in the cropped jacket announced, her voice a cruel parody of sympathy. So dramatic. Ryder, the man in the leather jacket, snorted. "This is why you don't play in a subway. It's embarrassing." Then came the final indignity. A woman in a bright yellow raincoat pushed through the crowd. "Oh, please," she said, her voice loud and nasal. "She's just showing off for tips." With a flick of her wrist, she tossed a crumpled dollar bill onto the piano. It landed on the keys with a soft, insulting thud, silencing a few notes in its wake. The crowd snickered, the sound grating like nails on a chalkboard. Alara's fingers didn't stop, but her eyes flicked to the crumpled bill resting on the white keys, then back down. Her face was a mask, unreadable. The music kept going, louder now, more urgent, as if it was fighting to be heard over the rising tide of their cruelty. She wasn't playing for them. She couldn't. She was playing for herself, for the sister who didn't understand, for the parents who told her she would never be enough. The music was her answer, her rebellion, her last act of holding on. Just when it seemed the wall of indifference and mockery had finally closed in, something inside Alara snapped. It wasn't a surrender, it was an ignition. The sorrowful, pleading notes of Chopin's Nocturne died away, the final chord hanging in the air for a heartbeat, pregnant with unspoken pain. And then, without warning, the music changed. What erupted from the battered piano was no longer a lament. It was a declaration of war. Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, fierce, wild, and utterly untamed. It was the sound of the storm outside finding its voice through her fingers. The music was no longer a gentle rain but a torrential flood, a torrent of sound that drowned out every jeer, every snicker, every whisper. Her fingers, which had trembled just moments before, now blurred across the keys. They were no longer appendages of a heartbroken girl. They were instruments of power, striking the keys with a precision and passion that was breathtaking. The notes were fire and ice, each one perfectly articulated, powerful, and terrifyingly alive. The old piano, which had sounded so frail, now roared like a beast awakened from a long slumber, its voice filling every corner of the vast, cavernous station. The crowd went silent, utterly, completely silent. The sound was so immense, so unexpected, that it seemed to suck the very air from the hall. People who had been rushing for their trains stopped dead in their tracks. The teenagers who had been filming lowered their phones, their mouths agape. Preston, the man in the blazer, froze. His smug smirk evaporated, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. The music was not just technically proficient. It was a masterpiece of emotional ferocity, played with a level of skill he had only ever heard in pristine concert halls. The woman he was with looked at him, her eyes wide, but he had nothing to say. His earlier question, "What do you even know about piano?" now sounded idiotic, a fool's taunt to a hidden god. Genevieve, the woman in the fur coat, stood rigid, her phone forgotten in her hand. The disdain on her face had melted away, leaving behind a confusing mixture of shock and something that looked almost like fear. Ryder, the self-proclaimed musical expert, stood with his arms still crossed, but the posture no longer looked arrogant. It looked defensive, small. He knew, with a certainty that churned his stomach, that he could practice for 1,000 years and never produce a sound so raw and so perfect. The subway hall was no longer a subway hall. It had been transformed. The grimy tile, the buzzing fluorescent lights, the distant rumble of the trains, it all faded into the background. It was a concert hall, and Alara was the only one on stage, her body swaying with the violent passion of the music. A janitor in his 60s, who had been leaning on his mop at the far end of the station, stood bolt upright. The music hit him like a physical blow, pulling up a memory he had buried long ago of his wife playing in their small apartment, back when they were young and life hadn't yet hardened them. Live streams, which had been started to mock her, suddenly lit up with hearts and comments flooding in. Who is she? This is incredible. I have chills. Ilara didn't see any of it. Her eyes were half closed, her face a mask of intense concentration. She wasn't performing, she was surviving. She was channeling every insult, every judgment, every ounce of her own pain and fury into the music. Rachmaninoff's Prelude was no longer just a composition, it was her autobiography, written in that moment, in chords of thunder and arpeggios of lightning. The music was her, raw and real and undeniable, and it demanded to be heard. The final, booming chords of the prelude echoed through the station, the vibrations seeming to hang in the very atoms of the damp air before finally fading into a profound, ringing silence. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the distant, muffled drumming of the rain outside. Ilara's hands rested on the keys, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. She remained with her head bowed, her curtain of damp hair hiding her face, as if she were a diver slowly resurfacing from an immense depth. The spell was broken by the quiet, authoritative purr of a high-end engine. Heads turned. A sleek black sedan, the kind that whispered of power and wealth, had pulled up to the curb just outside the station entrance. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was in his late 50s, his suit a masterpiece of understated black wool, crisp despite the rain. His hair was silver at the temples, and he moved with a calm, deliberate grace that commanded attention without demanding it. Whispers rippled through the stunned crowd as he walked into the station, his expensive leather shoes making almost no sound on the wet floor. People recognized him instantly. He was Alistair Sterling, the head of the world's most prestigious music conglomerate, a billionaire who didn't just fund orchestras, he created and destroyed careers with a single, quiet word. He was a kingmaker, a legend. He stopped a few feet from the piano, his gaze fixed not on the crowd, but on the small, hunched figure of Ilara. She didn't see him. She was still lost in the echo of her own music, her hands folded in her lap. The crowd held its collective breath, watching him, waiting. A few of the more cynical members began to murmur again. "Oh, come on," a man in a fedora sneered. "This is a setup. He's probably her manager." Alistair Sterling seemed not to hear them. He was listening to the silence, to the ghost of the music that still haunted the air. Then he stepped closer, his voice low but clear, cutting through the renewed whispers with the precision of a scalpel. "Child," he said. The word was gentle, paternal. "You just played Rachmaninoff with a true heart." The words landed like a stone in a still pond. The crowd gasped. The guy in the blazer, Preston, looked as if he'd been struck. The woman in the fur coat, Genevieve, averted her gaze, a flush of crimson rising on her cheeks. Ilara slowly lifted her head, her tired, tear-streaked eyes meeting Sterling's for the first time. She didn't speak. She just looked at him, a flicker of disbelief in her gaze. The whispers of doubt started again, sharper this time, laced with defiance. "He's just pitying her," a woman in a business suit scoffed, loud enough for him to hear. A reporter who had been passing through pushed forward, his microphone already out. "But she has no certification, no conservatory training. Who will believe her?" Sterling's gaze swept over the crowd, his eyes calm but hard, and in that single look, he seemed to see every one of them for who they were. Then he turned back to Ilara. His voice was steady, unwavering. "Anyone who doubts her, look at her hands," he said, his voice ringing with authority. He didn't need to shout. "These are hands orchestras will bow to." He pulled out his phone, his movements unhurried. He spoke into it, his words concise and devastatingly clear. "Prepare Carnegie Hall. I've found our headliner." A shock wave went through the crowd. Phones, which had been lowered, were raised again, but this time in awe, not mockery. The hall erupted in a chaos of gasps and frantic whispers. Tears spilled unchecked down Ilara's cheeks. But they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of a validation so profound it felt like a physical weight being lifted from her soul. But Alistair Sterling wasn't finished. As the crowd buzzed and phones flashed, he did something that silenced the room once more. He took another step forward, and in front of everyone, the reporters, the mockers, the stunned onlookers, he bowed. Not a nod, not a polite gesture. It was a full, deliberate, and deeply respectful bow. The billionaire, the kingmaker, his head lowered to the rain-soaked girl in the torn dress, the girl nobody thought mattered. The air grew thick with shock, and then, slowly, one person began to clap, then another, and another. Soon, the entire station was filled with thunderous applause, a sound that rose up and chased away the last shadows of cruelty, a sound that finally drowned out the rain. The next day, the headlines hit the city like a tidal wave. The weeping pianist, homeless girl in subway, chosen by Billionaire to headline Carnegie Hall. The story, fueled by dozens of viral videos, became an international sensation overnight. But the narrative wasn't just about Alara's triumph, it was also about the crowd's shame. Digital karma, swift and merciless, had come for those who had judged her. The video of Preston, his smug face contorted in disbelief as Rachmaninoff's fury erupted from the piano, went viral under the hashtag number BlazerBro. The prestigious law firm where he was an intern released a statement the following afternoon announcing his immediate dismissal, citing a lack of the character and judgment they required. Genevieve, the socialite in the fur coat, found her world crumbling. The clip of her muttering street drama queen was played on every morning show. The charity galas she chaired saw their donations plummet, and her name became synonymous with entitled cruelty. The invitations that had once defined her existence simply dried up. Ryder, the amateur musician in the leather jacket, made the fatal mistake of trying to capitalize on the moment. He posted a cover of the Rachmaninoff Prelude, only to be roasted into oblivion by commenters who relentlessly quoted his own words back at him. Street performers can never compare to professionals. His musical ambitions were over before they had ever truly begun. The others, the woman who filmed Alara's tears, the man who called her pathetic, deleted their social media accounts. But the internet never forgets. Their faces became memes, cautionary tales in the new digital fable. None of them had seen it coming. None of them thought their casual words, thrown like stones in a forgotten moment, would follow them home. Alara saw none of it. She didn't check her phone. She didn't read the news. She was in a quiet, luxurious hotel room that Alistair Sterling's team had booked for her. The silence was a balm. She sat on the edge of a plush bed, staring at a framed photo on the nightstand, a faded picture of her and her sister as children, laughing in a sun-drenched park a lifetime ago. Her hands rested in her lap, no longer trembling. They felt different now, imbued with a quiet strength, carrying the weight of the music she had played, not for fame or for money, but for her own soul. The next morning, a car came for her. When she walked into the gleaming, minimalist meeting room at Sterling Music Group, the entire executive staff, who had been seated around a long mahogany table, stood up as she entered. They didn't say her last name, but they knew it now. The news had broken that she was Alara Vance, daughter of the formidable Vance dynasty. But as she stood there, in a simple dress provided for her, she didn't wear the name like a crown. She didn't need to. There was a new authority in the way she carried herself, a quiet dignity forged in the crucible of public humiliation and private triumph. The way she sat down, without a word, said everything. The power she now possessed had not been inherited. It had been earned, note by painful, perfect note. Sometimes, life does not offer a second chance. Sometimes, there is only one moment, one choice, when the world is watching. A moment to either crumble under the weight of judgment or to stand in the eye of the storm and make it listen. Alara had stood in hers, and the world had finally seen her. Not her name, not her family, not her rain-soaked clothes, just her. And for every artist who has ever been silenced, for every dreamer who has ever been told they were not enough, for every soul who has ever felt invisible in a crowd, her moment was theirs, too. They weren't wrong. They weren't alone. Their music was just waiting for the right moment to play.